Welcome to Using an Expanded Cyber Kill Chain Model to Increase Attack Resiliency in South Seas ABF with Sean Malone. Before we get started, I would like to give a few brief announcements. We encourage you to stop by the business hall located in Bayside AB. The Black Hat Arsenal is on this floor in the Palm Foyer, and there will be a reception in the Arsenal area at 5 o'clock. If you have not picked up merchandise or swag, today is your last day to visit the bookstore in the official Black Hat shop down on level 2. And of course, visit the Kali Linux lab in Mandalay Bay A. Also, now is a good time to put your phone on vibrate, and we thank you for doing so. It makes it easier for the rest of us to ignore you ignoring your phone while we wait for your voicemail to pick it up. Without further ado, Sean Malone.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Bit of background here. I started in information security a little bit over 10 years ago. Started off building web applications and then realized that it was more fun to break them than build them. Moved from there into various forms of penetration testing, red teaming, and then the last 4 years has been doing adversary simulation exercises with FusionX. So when we say adversary simulation, this means executing realistic attack simulations to help the organizations that we work with first evaluate and then improve their overall ability to prevent, detect, and respond to attacks by sophisticated adversaries. So my role has been in designing and executing these attack simulations and then responding when it's not a simulation. So when we work with organizations to drill on this, then they bring us in when they actually have a breach that they're dealing with. So we've seen it from both sides, both the offensive side and the defensive side. And what we've seen is that the models that are used today are generally not sufficient to encompass the full range of actions that an adversary takes to go from, I have this idea that I'm going to attack a given organization, all the way through to accomplishing their end objective. So the purpose of the talk today is to go over first the legacy cyber kill chain model. This is the one that we know and love or have a love-hate relationship with, whatever it may be. There's been some both ways. And then to build on that and extend that to create an expanded cyber kill chain model, which includes, in addition to the legacy kill chain, and the internal kill chain and the target manipulation kill chain, and drill down into each of those as we use it to understand the stages of a sophisticated attack. What is the adversary doing at each stage, and how can we foil the adversary at each stage? First, to prevent it, or at least make it as difficult as possible to move from one stage to the next. And then if we can't prevent it, or after we've made it difficult, to detect when an adversary is at a given stage and looking to move to the next. And then finally, how do we pull all of this together and actually make it real, make it actionable to increase the attack resiliency of the enterprises that we work with, either as employees of given enterprises working with them on the inside, or as consultants, as vendors. Really, it's about how can we fit everything that we do in information security into this context of increasing attack resiliency. So diving into first the legacy cyber kill chain. This concept of applying the kill chain to the cyber realm has been around for a while. It was fairly recently popularized by Lockheed Martin, and they were the ones who first put together this sequence of 7 steps here, going from reconnaissance through to actions on objectives. As the adversary goes through this process, they start off with reconnaissance, essentially, what is this organization? What can I learn about both the technological and the human assets as well? How can we weaponize a payload, deliver that payload, use the payload to exploit a target system, regardless of how it might be delivered to that system, install additional capabilities on the end system that we've exploited, and then finally establish this covert command and control channel. This all leads up to stage 7 of actions on objectives. However, actions on objectives is a very small phase encompassing a lot of different activities within that stage 7. And so that's what we're going to drill down into today. So there's been mixed reactions to this model. It's a great first step. It's a move in the right direction. But various members of the industry have had some critique of it as well. So saying that it's a nice, sexy model, but at the same time, it doesn't go far enough, and it enforces this old school mindset of hard perimeter and focuses on what it takes to breach that perimeter, but doesn't say much about once you're on the internal network. So it's more focused on malware prevention. So it works for external attacks, but not so much for the insider attack. And the final piece here that really highlights the need for an expanded model is to recognize that every cyber attacker is a potential insider. So when we think of insider attacks, that typically means more of an individual who's been provisioned with access. So an employee, a contractor, a vendor, but even an external adversary. Their first move is going to be to breach the perimeter. From that point forward, they're an insider as well. So we need something more. Looking at this model again, if we see the breakdown here, we have 7 steps, and once we get to stage 7, there's an inclination to declare game over because you've reached the end of the kill chain. But we're seeing more and more that that's not sufficient. We have to operate under a presumption of breach. The adversary will get on the internal network. Every cyber attacker can and will be an insider if they have the dedication, the sophistication, and the resources to commit to it. So instead of looking at this as a comprehensive cyber kill chain, instead let's call this the perimeter breach kill chain. Because that's what this is. It really is looking at just the first stages in this attack. So this is all wrapped up into phase 1. How do we get to the internal network, but not where do we go once we're on the internal network to actually achieve that objective? Because the objective is usually not get a piece of data off of a workstation that I've compromised and where I have command and control. When we're talking about a sophisticated adversary with the intent and capability to cause material damage to an enterprise, the objectives are much broader. So when we have these actions on objectives, it really goes back to what is the motivation of the adversary. So here are some examples. The motivation may be financial theft, which correlates to an objective of modifying queued wire transfers before they go out to the Fedwire system. It may be reputation impact, trying to damage or tarnish a competitor's reputation, resulting in loss of market share. This can be done through denial of service against the organization's workstations. We can look at disabling infrastructure or gaining the ability to provide propaganda support for a coup attempt. We saw this in Turkey, where control of the media was absolutely critical to controlling the message. It's all about controlling the message of what's going on, and you do that through manipulating the broadcasts. You can do this by walking your military unit into the broadcast studio. You can also do this by hijacking the broadcasts and replacing it with your own video feed, regardless of whether or not you're physically in the same location. Even something as direct as a terrorist group looking to cause regional panic by manipulating the balance of chemicals in the water supply. These are objectives, and these are not objectives that are able to be accomplished simply by compromising a user's workstation. It requires going further beyond that. So this is where the expanded cyber kill chain model comes in. We start with the legacy cyber kill chain, which, as discussed, is really focused on breaching the perimeter. We move from that into the internal kill chain, gaining access to the target systems, essentially being on a network segment with the ability to talk to the target systems. So they may be in a secure enclave, a different site, a SCADA control room, whatever it is. You have to be able to talk to those systems in order to then move to the third stage, which is the target manipulation kill chain. In the target manipulation kill chain, the adversary is looking to subvert the processing of those systems in order to achieve whatever their specific objective may be. So let's drill down. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the legacy cyber kill chain. That's been thoroughly analyzed and used in a variety of models and looking at the different steps that are required and the different controls that can be implemented to make it as difficult as possible to move through those steps. Instead, we're focusing on the actions on objectives there. So essentially, everything that I'm talking about here fits into actions on objectives. So first, we explode this out into the internal kill chain. As the adversary goes through internal reconnaissance, internal exploitation, enterprise privilege escalation, so not on a single system, but really escalating privileges in the enterprise overall, going through the steps for lateral movement, and then finally gaining the ability to manipulate the target. Take this one step further, and we explode target manipulation into its own kill chain, where we again have reconnaissance, but this time on the target system specifically. Exploitation, weaponization, installation, and finally, execution of that weaponized target-specific malware to achieve the adversary's objective. The internal kill chain is going to be common to most objectives in that in most enterprises, the process of going from a compromised workstation or a device plugged into the network to the ability to talk to any system in any secure enclave on the network is a fairly standardized process in most enterprises. The target manipulation kill chain, on the other hand, is highly objective specific. So the steps to go through here, while we have abstracted and generalized into the ones as listed, that's going to look very different if you're looking to manipulate industrial control systems versus redirect wire transfers. Note that there are stages here that occur in multiple kill chains: reconnaissance, exploitation, weaponization. These are activities that the adversary engages in again and again. So they go through essentially a cycle. And that leads to one of the other criticisms of this model overall, is that it's a linear model. So should we be thinking in terms of a kill chain, or is it really more of the OODA loop that's also been put forward? So the OODA loop comes from the world of fighter pilots engaged in a dogfight. In the dogfight, each fighter pilot goes through this sequence of observing their surroundings, orienting themselves in space and relative to their adversary, deciding what the best course of action is, and then engaging in that action, acting to accomplish their objective. Once they act, it goes back to the beginning. The situation has changed, and they now need to go back to observing and engage in that phase again. And so this loop goes on. The reason this is relevant here is that in the dogfight world, if you can go through this loop more quickly, you increase your chance of success and survival. Similarly, if you can disrupt your adversary's OODA loop by forcing them to spend more time, or by adapting your environment such that they have to go back and observe because the environment has changed before they can get to acting, then you can disrupt their actions and make it take longer. So this is a valuable perspective as well. It's a different lens to view the same operation. So from one perspective, it's a line, a linear kill chain model. From another, it's a circle. Combine these, and essentially we get a spiral. Going through this process of reconnaissance, exploitation, escalation, and lateral movement, as the adversary moves from outside of the network, breaching the perimeter, going through the internal kill chain, and then the target manipulation kill chain. So this is perhaps a more accurate, more complete model. But even this may not go far enough, because this model still supposes that the adversary is going along a single track as they go through this process. But as someone who's both participated in simulated attacks and responded to attacks, that's not how it works. Instead, perhaps we should look at it as a tree. The adversary has this point that they're starting at, just call it the origin, and they have an objective that they're looking to get to. As they go through this process, there will be false starts. There will be different avenues of attack. And essentially, it's like a lightning strike, spreading out to find the path of least resistance until you can map through these different links and connections that you can make to the point where you can achieve the objective. My point with these different models is that there are multiple equally valid ways to view this and to conceptualize this process depending on what we're looking to get out of it. So, without claiming that it's better or more correct, the one that I'm focusing on here is that expanded linear kill chain model. I'm not making a claim that the movement through that will be strictly sequential and strictly linear, but rather that these are stages that the adversary will need to go through in some manner, in some order, in order to accomplish their objectives. They may go through it more than the two additional kill chains that I've identified. If you have multiple tiers, multiple layers that they need to breach, they'll go through this internal kill chain process for each layer that they need to get past. Let's now turn our attention to using this model to understand what a sophisticated attack looks like and what each one of those stages means. For each stage here, we'll look at the overall objective from the adversary's perspective. What are they looking to achieve? We'll look at the time required, and this time required is often a wide range, and this is for a hypothetical typical enterprise, typical objective. This will vary widely. So this is not something where any given stated time required is particularly defensible. I'm not making a claim that it's always going to be within this range, but simply that from experience going through these types of engagements, it's a way to understand the relative amount of time spent in the various stages. We'll look at the offensive TTPs that the adversary is using, tactics, techniques, and procedures. How do they complete their objective? And then the defensive TTPs. How can we prevent and detect an adversary who's at this stage and looking to move to the next one? So for internal reconnaissance here, again, we're skipping over the legacy kill chain. So the adversary has access to the internal network. They likely have access to a single user's workstation. Now what? They're looking to remain undetected. So the first thing that they're going to do is data mine the access that, or the information to which they already have access. This is done through DOMEX, documented media exploitation, of local files on that workstation, as well as network shares, the browser history on the workstation, SharePoints, wikis, and so on, and using that to identify systems of interest and then lightly probing those. So not conducting a large scan, but simply, are there particular ports or services available that we might be interested in as we look to identify vulnerabilities that let us move from a compromised workstation to a compromised server. We can make this more difficult as the defender through granular resource authorization. So a given user, if compromised, has a limited negative impact and amount of damage from that compromise. And we can detect this through behavioral changes. If a given user has access to a large number of file shares, but they only, on a regular basis, retrieve files from 1 or 2, and then tomorrow they retrieve files from 100, something's changed. If we can identify what has changed, then there is a decent chance of identifying when an account has been compromised, even if we're not able to detect the particular command and control channel being used. We move on then to internal exploitation. We've identified the vulnerabilities and useful information. Now we move to exploiting it in order to gain access to systems. So this may be system-level vulnerabilities, missing patches, but more frequently it's web application vulnerabilities, broadcast protocol spoofing, or even something as simple as poor security hygiene, default credentials, all of these types of things, going from access to this workstation to access to a server. So of course then, prevention is about good security hygiene in the enterprise, patch and vulnerability management, including those lower value assets, the development, the test systems, all of these which can be used as stepping stones, even if they are not in and of themselves a high value asset. Detection, this is one where endpoint protection on servers as well can be useful, particularly some of the next generation solutions that look more at the behavior on the workstations as opposed to simply signature-based detections. Once we're on the system, so once we've gained access to one or more servers, then we want to escalate privileges across the enterprise. So part of this is indeed escalating privileges on the individual server to the point where we're an administrative user, and then being able to leverage techniques such as pass the hash, Mimikatz to retrieve plain text credentials, use those to expand our level of access. Unprotected SSH keys are wonderful for this. Credentials and configuration files, all of these types of things that let us extend compromise of a single system to compromise of many systems. Prevention is about running applications with the lowest level of privilege possible, using good security hygiene, and again, behavioral analytics. When is an account behaving in a way that it's not normally supposed to? Once we have access to these privileged accounts, so this may be the service accounts in Active Directory, domain admin accounts. These are not objectives in and of themselves, but stepping stones towards the adversary's objective. This leads us to lateral movement. We now have the credentials. We have the privileged access. And this allows us to pivot through compromised systems. We may not need to identify a vulnerability in a system used as a pivot point if we can simply use a compromised account to log in and create an SSH tunnel to that point, and then go through that and create an SSH tunnel to the next point, and so on. It's not uncommon to have SSH tunnels that are nested 3 or 4 layers deep in order to access the network subnet that has the target systems that we care about. All of this is preparation for moving into the target manipulation kill chain. So at this stage, prevention is about making this as difficult as possible, requiring the adversary to go through as many steps as possible or as many iterations of that internal kill chain to be able to talk to the systems they care about. And then again, looking at the login events here. There's still this tendency to think that we should be focusing on failed login events to see when someone is trying to brute force or guess a password. But really, the more damaging events are the successful ones. Because if there's an anomalous successful event, this means that the adversary was able to authenticate to the system. So if we can identify this administrator normally works on these 50 systems. Today, they're connecting to this system in a completely different area of the network. Pick up the phone and call them. Why? Why are they connecting to this different network zone? Is it in line with their responsibilities? These types of simple steps here can drastically increase the chances of detecting an adversary looking to do this type of lateral movement. And that then leads us to the target manipulation kill chain. So the first step here is going back to reconnaissance. Now the adversary is at a point in the organization on the enterprise network where they're able to talk to the target systems that they need to manipulate to achieve their objective. They're looking to map and understand the objective-specific systems. This includes looking at the vendor documentation, perhaps going out and getting a sample or a proof of concept, a pilot of this software, and looking to see what information we can find on the internal network as well. So as we've gone through the internal reconnaissance and the internal kill chain, we're also keeping an eye out. Where can we find information on wikis, SharePoints, etc., that point us in this direction and tell us how the internal administrators operate these systems? Because we're looking to ideally use standard administrative utilities. So the network traffic should look completely normal. A good adversary, once they have this level of access, is simply an unauthorized system administrator. The tools, the protocols are exactly the same. So to prevent this, we want to restrict access to that documentation and specifications. And again, detection is around access patterns. Is a new account accessing the system? Is it accessing it at a time or from a source location that is not in line with normal patterns? Target exploitation. We list the time required here as 1 hour because when you get to this stage, you already own the enterprise. In most cases, there is not sufficient segmentation between the authentication systems for the enterprise and for the high-value assets. When there is, it drastically increases this time. So sometimes it's default credentials. More frequently, it's a privileged Active Directory account for the enterprise as a whole that also allows you to log into the HMI workstation in your plant control room. But if you can break that trust relationship, then you increase this time from 1 hour to days or weeks, as the adversary needs to then do research to exploit new vulnerabilities to access these systems. Once we're on these systems, we move into weaponization. So this is, again, going back to the same skills and techniques used to weaponize a piece of malware that can be used to breach the perimeter. But in this case, we're targeting not a user's workstation, but the objective systems that we care about. To do this, we use the internal reconnaissance and the exploitation to extract firmware and to know exactly what devices, down to the individual model numbers of the devices in the field, particularly in the case of industrial control systems. And we build these in our lab. So we then have a lab environment that looks exactly like what's out in the field in the target organization. This lets us go through the hardware hacking process of extracting firmware, reverse engineering that firmware, and then creating modified firmware that breaks the business logic in subtle ways to be able to manipulate the outputs in that industrial control system while at the same time disconnecting the outputs from the monitoring process. When we have this fully weaponized in that setting, we can be turning valves and pipelines on and off, and it's reporting back to the control station that nothing has changed. So you're looking to not just take control, but take control in a way that is subtle enough that it subverts the detective controls as well. So the general hardening principles here are going to increase the time required to do this. It's not really possible to detect when an adversary is doing this stage because it's offline, it's in their lab environment. But you can make it take longer by having hardened, obfuscated applications. So assuming that at some point an adversary will be able to extract the firmware from this device, and we want to make it as hard as possible for them to actually weaponize the malware targeting these systems. Installation then, again, very quick. We've already done the exploitation, we've already done the weaponization. We have access to install the firmware. If we're doing application signing and file integrity monitoring, this is a good place to be able to catch the adversary, make it difficult for them to install something using or install something without going through the extra step of signing that new binary, and having file integrity monitoring on these critical systems to detect when something has changed. At this point, we have fully weaponized malware to subvert the target systems. We've installed it, and we're ready to execute. We're one step away. But it's not uncommon for the adversary to go dark at this point and wait. Maintain that level of access, be at the stage T-1, and wait for conditions to be right before they move to execution. In execution, pretty straightforward. They're looking to execute the installed weaponized malware in order to achieve their objective, which results in some form of gain for themselves and material negative consequences for their target. But they're waiting for the optimal timing. And this timing is driven by a number of factors. It may be market conditions. Imagine being able to take out a competing retailer on Black Friday. If you can't process transactions, that's a pretty big hit to their revenue. It may also be geopolitical. Getting to T-1, going dark and waiting until you're ready to begin your coup attempt, or you're ready to begin a kinetic invasion and you want to make the country go dark in preparation for that. At this point, it's too late to talk about prevention controls. Prevention has failed. Now we move into the response. How quickly can we respond to a catastrophic event, and do we have the framework to do that? We've done these attack simulations from a zero-notice perspective, where we get to the point where the broad enterprise-wide incident response process has been activated, and the executives of a large financial institution are sitting in a war room trying to determine what the right next step is. And what they realized was that they don't have a framework to determine the relative impact and the relative negative consequences of leaving a compromised wire transfer system online versus taking that system offline and shutting down their ability to process wires on behalf of their customers. So these are the types of extreme situations that need to be wargamed ahead of time so that you have a framework within which to respond in the best interests of the organization. Breach insurance may help with the recovery in terms of the forensics, the containment, eradication, rebuilding systems. It's usually not going to help with the lost market share, the damage to the reputation, and so on. So this execution, this is what we're trying to avoid here. So all of the attack resiliency and the prevention and detection controls all lead up to making it as difficult as possible for the adversary to get to this stage. So how do we do that? In order to build a resilient enterprise and make it take as long as possible and be as difficult as possible to go through not just the legacy kill chain, but the internal kill chain and the target manipulation kill chain, we need to understand first that resiliency, more than a particular architecture or particular control or solution, it's not a silver bullet. It's a mindset. It's a mindset of looking at every control and saying every control will fail at some point, and being able to respond when it does. So this photograph is from a hotel in Riyadh that I was at a few months ago. I'm sitting at a coffee bar and I order a bottle of sparkling water. And the attendant there's a single employee at this coffee bar. He says, well, I don't have it here. I need to go back to a storeroom to get it. He turns the key to lock the cash drawer, pulls out the key and sets it on top of the cash drawer, and then walks back to go get the bottle of water, leaving this register completely unattended. And it was so clear what had happened. Somebody had trained this employee, and he'd been well trained and had really kept this in mind and followed the letter of the policy. He was almost certainly told, do not walk away, leaving the key in the cash drawer. So he didn't. he followed the letter of the policy, and the control still failed. This is an easy-to-see example in the physical world, but the same thing happens all the time for cybersecurity controls. So if we assume that every control will fail at some point, if the adversary has access to the internal network, to any given username and password, including your privileged accounts, your service accounts, domain admin accounts, these accounts that allow access to a large degree of your enterprise. And they have access to all documentation and specifications, your internal network diagrams, the vendor documentation. What would you do differently? Are you designing your architecture with this in mind? And not just your network architecture, but your backups, your virtualization, your authentication systems, the level of authentication that you put on the applications, how you harden the application servers to make it more difficult for somebody who's authenticated to the server to get database credentials. All of these types of things assume that the adversary will be able to get to that stage and make it as hard as possible for them to move to each subsequent stage. So what we're looking to do here is to affect the time required. First, the time required for the adversary to achieve their objective. We want to increase that time so it takes as long as possible for them to achieve their objective. This is done through the addition of effective prevention controls. On the right-hand side, the time required to detect and eradicate that intrusion. We want to decrease that, and we decrease it through the addition of effective detection and response controls. At a certain point, these cross. We call this the threshold of defender success. This means that when these two cross, the defending security operations team has a high chance of being able to detect and eradicate the intrusion before the adversary has achieved their objective. Note that this is for a given adversary sophistication level. In the presence of a certain ecosystem of controls, the adversary can also manipulate the time required on both the left and the right-hand side here. And they can do that by increasing their level of sophistication. More skilled adversaries on their team. Deeper investment in their own research and development. Purchasing additional 0 days on the black market. And what this gets at is that the level of adversary sophistication really translates to the level of the adversary's investment. So what we're looking to do is shift the economic model. If we plot the strength of the defenses, now considering both prevention and detection and response as one category, the overall strength of the defenses, versus the sophistication required, but really it's the adversary investment required. As expected, when we increase the strength of the defenses, we increase the investment required for the adversary to achieve their objective. The adversary has a certain objective in mind, a certain reason, a certain motivation, and we can translate that loosely to a dollar value as well. There's some value to the adversary of the asset that we're defending. This is not to say that every adversary is strictly financially motivated, but simply that they have a certain value, and if they can't achieve their objective in a way that makes economic sense, even for non-economically motivated adversaries, they're going to go after different objectives, or they're going to go after perhaps a similar objective with a different target organization. This lets us define a danger zone and a safe zone. So when you're above this line, the adversary needs to spend more than their return if they succeed. This means that it doesn't make sense for them to attack you because they have a negative ROI. The danger zone is where they have a positive ROI. Even within the danger zone, it's not a binary safe or danger zone in terms of where you want to be. Ideally, yes, every organization would be in the safe zone. However, there's also a cost for the defending organization, an investment required to move towards the right, increasing the strength of the defenses. So it's not always economically, from the defender's perspective, the best decision to invest to the point where you're in this safe zone. But if you can move to the right through strategic, smart investments in your overall defensive capabilities, you can decrease the adversary's ROI even if it's still positive. And so if there's an organization that's in the bottom left of this chart, that's going to be a more likely target than an organization that's in the middle or towards the right but still in the danger zone. If the adversary can achieve the same or a similar objective through two different routes, they're going to take the path of least resistance, the path of a lower investment for them, because it means that there is a higher return on investment for them. So pulling this all together then, we want to be able to increase the strength of the defenses with the minimum investment required. Or to flip that on its head, for a given level of investment, we want to move as far to the right as possible. And that's where the internal kill chain and the target manipulation kill chain comes in. So we don't need to call it game over just because an adversary has access to the internal network. If we understand the additional steps that they need to move through, and we can make it take as long as possible for them to move through those, and increase our chances of being able to detect and respond to an adversary who's looking to go from one stage to the next, that means that we have so many more chances to slow down and stop an adversary looking to achieve one of these damaging objectives than if we're focused exclusively on blocking them at the perimeter. The perimeter is important, yes, but every cyber adversary is going to be an insider at some point if they are sufficiently dedicated. So the final point here is, how do you know? How can you test this? And this goes back to the concept of adversary simulation. And this is something that it's near and dear to my heart, having spent a fair amount of time here. But we're finding that it's really the most effective way to determine where are you on this horizontal axis. If you go out and actually determine what are the most likely adversaries, what are their most likely motivations and objectives, and then simulate that style of an attack, and this can be by an internal red team, it can be by an external red team, but taking this approach of a business level objective, a zero knowledge, zero notice simulated attack can tell you a lot about how easy it is or how difficult it is for the adversary to move through this internal kill chain and the target manipulation kill chain. And if you can do that, then that will tell you where the gaps are and where the smart money is to be able to invest in specific stages of defenses corresponding to specific changes or specific stages, not just of the legacy kill chain, but also the internal and the target manipulation kill chains. Thank you. Any questions? Could I ask you to go to the microphone right there?
I noticed that when you were talking about the horizontal, you put it in terms of the strength of the controls, but with the vertical, it was the investment. You could equally well speak of the horizontal in terms of dollars and have a line past which you wouldn't want to go because it exceeds the value of your assets.
Yes.
So do you have another slide, or would you consider putting another slide addressing that? And equally well, you could put the adversary's attack, let's say it's China, in terms not of money, but what's the strength of their Red Army cyber troops, and that might not have a dollar value to them because they're planning on starting World War III, and they want to be in a good place to do it, at least in the cyber world. So you could flip those emphases so that it was really the strength of their tools on the vertical and the value that we put on our assets on the horizontal. That would be a different kind of analysis, sort of the corollary.
Correct. And the only reason why I don't do that is that can sometimes lead a defending organization to think in terms of, well, just how much money do I need to throw at this problem? And if I throw enough money at it, then I'll be secure enough. I'd rather look at it as I need to increase the attack resiliency to a certain point, and I want to be as efficient as possible.
No doubt.
So yes, there is always going to be a translation into dollars on the defending side as well. But we do want to be as efficient as possible with that investment.
And you can look at it from both perspectives. So here we're looking at it from efficiency, which is what you just did. And on the other side, we're looking at it from cost. And in the commercial world, the analysis that you're providing is probably the best. But if you're talking to the DoD or somebody, they may not be that worried about, or any government agency, they may not be that worried about how much it costs the adversary. They want to know how effective the adversary is. And on the other hand, they have a budget that they can't exceed. So that might be the information they want to hear. Oh, well, best bang for my buck. But, what's the point at which I can't spend any more money?
Right. Yeah, and there are lots of different ways to model this. And thank you. I think that's a good call out.
I'd like to thank you for bringing up the idea that the adversary is trying to do something other than gain root on server 12. I mean, that's really good at enter an objective. Along with that, may I suggest that beyond just the two measures of time you brought up, maybe then the same idea helping the defender look at ultimately what I want to do is I want my business or mission to succeed, and I want to have greater confidence that that'll happen. And in that vein, something like engineering a risk-aware mission process and wise use of IT, the IT a component of a system called the how I do my business, and allocating to that system a portion of the business cyber defense, eyes wide open, what can it really do? Alternate ways of conducting my mission or business.
Right.
And I focus again on that end state of if the mission succeeds, if I'm successful in business, that's what I want to achieve. And the things you talked about, the time things, that's part of how I might do it. But maybe I have a manual override switch I can throw. But I won't think about that unless we continue what you started, which is what is the adversary's real objective? It's not that thing in the system. That's only an intermediary. I thank you for bringing it up. Maybe those other ideas will help too.
Sure. Thank you.
Question?
Yes.
The time proposals that you suggested I thought were interesting. I didn't actually start adding them up until you went fairly far through, but they added up to a fairly extended engagement time frame, which I think is accurate for attackers. But I'm curious, as a red team, where we obviously don't have the same luxury of time in most cases. Even when we're doing full red team engagements, it's rare for it to be a 6 or 12-month engagement unless you've got a very specialized customer that you're working with. Where have you found the opportunities for either compression or essentially cheating and shortening things down?
So first, we do the full-scale attack simulations, sometimes with the right customers who have targets on their back and see the value in doing that full, more extended, sophisticated simulation. So it's not uncommon for us to do attack simulations where we are embedded in their network for 9, 12, or more months. And in that case, we will go through that full process. But there are elements when you're testing this that you can shortcut. And those would be things like, if an organization really fully understands, yes, an adversary will get on the internal network, you can start on the internal network. Alternately, you can shortcut the reconnaissance phase by providing pointers to the red team on where the systems of interest may be. Excuse me. All right, thank you.